My name is Eric Sandeno, and I work for the Wilderness and Wild and Scenic River program in the Washington office, but I actually sit on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest in Everett, Washington. Shelley Crausbay from the Office of Sustainability and Climate and myself will be discussing wilderness, wild and scenic rivers, climate change, wildfire, and prescribed fire with you for this session. The thing is, though, we titled that terribly because Shelley's last, so climate will be the last portion versus the first portion, as it really lays out in the title. So I hope you had an opportunity to sit in on the sessions earlier today that Becky Blanchard and Nancy Taylor gave on the protections of wilderness and wild and scenic rivers, the similarities, differences, and when they overlap. And I also know that there was a session that ran somewhat concurrent with that Dan Morris gave on the minimum requirements analysis framework. But these sessions will actually build nicely from those earlier sessions, and hopefully between what Becky and Nancy and Dan and Shelley and myself will do, it really connects some good dots for you, because I really think that they kind of really feed on each other. So here's an outline for the first part of the session, and this is what I'm going to be covering. So I'm going to go over how wildfire and prescribed fires are addressed in law and policy for both wilderness and wild and scenic river corridors. We'll go into some more detail for prescribed fire in wilderness, as this is the topic that I think is really not clear for a lot of people, and hopefully I can dispel some of the myths that exist around what the sideboards really are. And at the end of my time, I'll give an update on some manual revisions for both wilderness and wild and scenic rivers that we are currently working on. And after that, I'll turn it over to Shelley. So let's talk about wildfires first. So for both wild and scenic rivers and wilderness, the first place we look is law. As shown here, the primary mandate of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is to protect and enhance water quality, free flowing conditions, outstandingly remarkable values, and the river's classification. Wildfire is not specifically mentioned anywhere in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So, since it's not specifically mentioned, we have to look to this primary mandate to actually guide all of our actions within wild and scenic river corridors. The next place to get information is agency policy. Forest Service Manual 2354 provides the agency policy for wild and scenic river management. Not a surprise, our manual actually lines up really nicely with law, and that we are to protect the free flowing condition of designated wild and scenic rivers and preserve and enhance the values for which they were established. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Manual does provide some direction for wildfires. We are to manage fire within a designated river area in a manner compatible with the contiguous National Forest System lands. The manual also says that we are to use suppression activities that cause the least lasting impact on the river and river area. And finally, conduct pre suppression and prevention activities to reflect the management objectives for specific river segments. So, in other words, what all this is actually saying is look to your comprehensive river management plan and your land management plan to provide the details on how wildfires are managed within wild and scenic river corridors. So, what does your land management plan say? If you're not sure, I encourage you to take a look at it and see if it provides any clear guidance that meets the sideboards that are outlined for the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So now let's take a look at the Wilderness Act and see what it says about wildfires in wilderness. So, Section 4D of the Wilderness Act, which is the section in the Act about special provisions, does mention wildfire. This language about the control of fire is pretty darn intentional, as it fit nicely with the agency philosophy of fire suppression at the time, which was 1964. So, what was the agency opinion about fire suppression? So this photo pretty much represents the agency fire control policy at that time. This is actually a staged photo from 1955 on the Shasta Trinity National Forest in California. But here we see in one image, it demonstrates any and all means available in responding to a fire to control it and suppress it as quickly as possible. You see a little smoke out there, and you've got bulldozers, smoke jumpers, people coming in on horseback, a helicopter, jeeps, fire trucks, you name it. Everything is rushing in to suppress that fire. The Wilderness Act allows the control of fire, but without specifics. The Wilderness Manual, similar to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Manual, points to the land management plan to provide the standards and guidelines on what the management of wildfire actually means. If you have adequate direction in your land management plan, one way to make sure the direction is taken into consideration during a wildfire response is to make sure pertinent information is included in the Wildland Fire Decision Support System. This system is a tool that the agency leaders use to ensure wildland fire decisions consider objectives found within the land management plan. The Fire Management Manual direction states that Wildland Fire Decision Support System will be used to analyze wildfire situations when a wildfire goes beyond initial attack. But those objectives can't be considered unless information about wilderness and wild and scenic rivers is actually within the Wildland Fire Decision Support System. So I've been conducting some random reviews and I'm finding that wilderness information in this database is a little bit hit and miss, and wild and scenic river information is just pretty much a miss. Each unit has a wildland fire decision support system coordinator, and if you don't know who that person is, I suggest you check with your FMO. They probably have they can give you that contact. But if you get a chance, look into this into this database to see what it says about your wilderness or wild and scenic river. So let's move on to prescribed fire. So in January 2022, the Forest Service launched a 10-year strategy to address wildfire crisis in places where fire poses an immediate threat to communities. The strategy outlines the need to significantly increase fuel and forest health treatments to address the wildfire danger that threatens millions of acres across numerous communities throughout the United States. In April 2022, the force selected 10 initial landscapes in 8 states to invest funding from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. In January 2023, the Forest Service selected 11 additional landscapes. So there are actually 84 wilderness areas totaling about 4 million acres and 39 wild and scenic rivers, plus an additional 300 study rivers included within these landscapes nationwide. Due to the attention of the wildfire crisis strategy landscapes, and since they include so many designated areas, we've seen a lot of confusion and misunderstanding about what type of project work can take place within a wild scenic river corridor or within a wilderness. So, according to manual direction for wild and scenic rivers, prescribed fire is allowed in wild and scenic river corridors, though the manual does not provide a lot of detail other than prescribed fire may be utilized. So, what are your sideboards? So, remember this? Not too long ago, we talked about the statutory requirements of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Since law always overrides policy, when you have a lack of detail in policy, look to the law. By policy, prescribed fire can be utilized in the Wild and Scenic River Corridor, and the law lets us know that the primary mandate of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is to protect and enhance water quality, free flowing conditions, outstandingly remarkable values, and classification. You must apply the requirements of this primary mandate to a prescribed burning in a Wild and Scenic River Corridor. If you can design a product or a project which prescribed fire burn will actually meet the mandate of the law, prescribed fire is allowed. So I'm actually going to spend the rest of my time focusing on prescribed fire in wilderness because this is really where most of the questions come up. And why is this where most of our questions are? Well, we've had for a long time a misperception about what is allowed by the Wilderness Act, a lack of clarity in the Forest Service Manual 2320, which is the Wilderness Management Manual, often a lack of detail in land management plans, and honestly, a history of wilderness managers just saying no has created an assumption that project work can't occur in wilderness. So let's look to Section 4B of the Wilderness Act, which is the use of wilderness area. This actually gives us the primary and affirmative management direction for wilderness, the preservation of wilderness character. The congressional record supports this by stating the overriding principle guiding management of all wilderness areas, regardless of which agency administers them, is the Wilderness Act Section 4B mandate to preserve their wilderness character. We'll get back to this very soon, but there's not a ton of specifics here in Section 4B to let us know exactly what preserved wilderness character actually means. But as a reminder from some of your Wilderness 101 courses, and Nancy and Becky brought this up earlier today, wilderness character is derived from the five qualities of wilderness character. So, which they come from Section 2C of the Wilderness Act and express the congressional intent for the meaning of wilderness. So, these qualities are the untrammeled quality, the natural quality, the undeveloped quality, solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation quality, and the other features of value quality. Section 4C of the Wilderness Act is where we find the detailed prohibition of certain uses. There are 10 prohibitions identified in Section 4C. The two big ones: no commercial enterprise and no permanent roads. And then we have eight no's that have an exception associated with them. So those are the no temporary road, no use of motor vehicles, no motorized equipment, no motorboats, no landing of aircraft, no other form of mechanical transport, and no structure, no installation. And that exception that's associated with these is the minimum requirements analysis. And as Dan talked about earlier, he went over the minimum requirements analysis framework process. So, this analysis is used to determine if a prohibited use can be justified as the minimum tool needed to administer the area as wilderness. While the action of prescribed fire itself is not a prohibited use, several of the tools and methods often considered for prescribed fires certainly are prohibited uses, and their use can only be allowed if approved through the minimum requirements analysis process. But again, Section 4C allows consideration of activities if they are necessary to meet the minimum requirements for the administration of the area as wilderness. So, in short, to preserve wilderness character. There's a lot of things tied to the preservation of wilderness character. And while wilderness character is not explicitly defined in the Wilderness Act, your enabling legislation can be a great source for each wilderness area's unique combination of geographic settings and social and biophysical properties, or in other words, again, wilderness values identified by Congress that make up the character of the area. So, as an example, let's take a peek at the legislation for the rattlesnake wilderness, which I have in the center of the slide here. At the end of the page, I outlined a portion of the law in which Congress calls out several values tied to this wilderness: watershed, recreation, wildlife, and education. These values are components within the qualities that make up the area's wilderness character. The Interagency Wilderness Character Monitoring Program, outlined in Keeping It Wild 2, uses the five qualities of wilderness character to form the foundation of monitoring wilderness to determine how wilderness character is changing over time. As part of the Forest Service implementation of wilderness character monitoring, each wilderness is required to develop a wilderness character narrative, which describes what is unique and special about a specific wilderness. The narrative is organized by each of the qualities of wilderness character and comes from legislative and administrative documentation associated with the designation. The narrative won't define the activities that can be done to preserve wilderness character, but the narrative will outline the details of what makes up the wilderness character for your area. You can then use that information in the narrative to determine if any project will or will not preserve wilderness character. You'll also want to see if there are any details in your legislation tied to special provisions. Here's an example of an area designated through the American Endangered American Wilderness Act of 1978 to show you just how specific the detailed some special provisions related to fire can actually be. The special provision authorizes the Forest Service to take whatever appropriate actions are necessary for fire prevention and watershed protection, including but not limited to acceptable fire pre suppression and fire suppression measures and techniques. The House report that accompanied this act went so far as specifically call out the use of prescribed fire as a prevention tool. So later in the section of this legislation, but actually not shown on my screen, this law states the Forest Service will use the forest plan to outline what is allowed per this special provision. So, what are the key takeaways from our short discussion looking at legislation here? Knowing the specifics about the components that make up the qualities of wilderness character for your wilderness is essential for considering any project, including prescribed fire. So, I want to make it clear I'm not trying to find a way for you to conduct a prescribed fire or any type of project in your wilderness. Wilderness has a very high bar, and we have a very large and diverse wilderness system. There is no one size fits all approach to wilderness management. If the purpose of the project can further wilderness character, it's the job of the Forest Service to be able to link the necessity of the project and furthering wilderness character to justify the benefit of that project. At the same time, if you can't link the project to furthering wilderness character, should that project actually occur? So, when is the last time you took a hard look at your enabling legislation? I encourage you to go to Wilderness Connect, find your wilderness, pull up the enabling legislation, and for many areas out there, you have more than one. Read through it. Does it specify values that are part of the area's character? Does it include any special provisions? If you determined that there was necessity for prescribed fire in your wilderness, is there any language in your legislation to actually support that? Did you see something new that you've missed in the past? And I also encourage you to go take a look at your wilderness character narrative if you have one, and if you haven't looked at it recently. You may find some things associated with the values for that area that were identified that you didn't really think of, tied to how that makes wilderness character for your area. So we're not going to switch from our focus from law and policy to really talk a little bit more about what you can, from what you can do in wilderness to really what should you do in wilderness. So, the philosophical discussion about the role of prescribed fire in wilderness has been going on since the 1980s. In 1993, Chris Ryan of the Carhart National Wilderness Training Center actually stated that the issue is more philosophical than scientific because we are dealing with wilderness areas. So, Chris continued that no amount of data is going to change how people feel about wilderness and whether they think that more aggressive management is right or not. So, what is the source of the philosophical debate? It's actually Section 2C of the Wilderness Act. So, Section 2C defines wilderness and states that wilderness areas, in contrast with those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape, the law defined wilderness as undeveloped federal land where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man. Land that retains a primeval character and influence. Perhaps most significantly, the Wilderness Act required that wilderness be protected and managed, though it appeared to be affected primarily by the forces of nature, with man's imprint substantially unnoticeable. The 2022 Wildfire Crisis Strategy identifies climate change, increased wildland urban interface, and accumulating fuels as the cause of the crisis. Specific to the accumulating fuels, the strategy outlines what the agency has done to create this situation. So in 1911, the federal policy put an end to the use of ground fires to keep landscapes open. In 1935, the Forest Service adopted a policy of extinguishing all wildland fires by the morning after the first the fire was detected, often referred to as the 10 a.m. policy. By the 1950s and 60s, wildland fire had become so effective, or wildland fire fighting had become so effective, that the area burned each year had fallen to just a fraction of historical extent. For more than a century, fuels have been building up to due to national policy of fire exclusion. Fuel buildups have actually reached a crisis proportion as described in the strategy. So remember this slide? The fire control approach that was in place for so long is what the wildfire crisis strategy is directly referring to. We don't have time to get into this discussion now, but especially if you got a group of people around the table right now, or after this, if you wanted to have a campfire discussion, I encourage you to think about this on your own. Should we consider the agency's past suppression actions, which created fuel buildup, to be an intentional manipulation or trammeling, or impacting natural conditions and the forces of nature? Even if we can connect current fuel buildup in wilderness to past agency policy, should we be taking actions to restore conditions based on what we think those conditions should be? Again, we don't have time for a group discussion on this one, but I really do think it's a really good discussion for you to have with somebody else, and just see what your thoughts are on this. We have started to update the fire management sections for both wilderness and wild and scenic river manuals. The Forest Service provided recommendations to the Secretary of Agriculture in the fall of 2023 in response to the Secretarial Memo on Climate and Carbon. The Secretary recently approved policy and programmatic actions to be developed, including wilderness and wild and scenic river manual direction updates. Current manual direction lacks contemporary direction regarding fire activities as a whole, such as mitigation measures for fire suppression activities, the use of resource advisors, and resource protection measures. Also absent is direction related to the use of prescribed fire and other fuels treatments, especially as a means to promote fire resilient landscapes and support the incorporation of indigenous knowledge. Two task teams have been developed, comprised of Washington office staff, regional program managers, climate specialists, fire staff, and line officers to develop proposed policy and supporting supplemental materials. Internal and external stakeholder meetings are being planned right now, so keep an eye out for that information. And I encourage you to attend and provide your input in those sessions. Okay, with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Shelley, and she's going to switch our discussion to climate.
As Eric said, my name is Shelley Crausbay. I am with the Forest Service in the Office of Sustainability and Climate, and I want to just follow up with Eric's discussion on the legal and policy frameworks to think about how we could really make climate-informed decisions about wildfire management in wilderness. And actually, I just put this slide in right when I heard Eric talking about the 10 a.m. rule. So I want to talk about why we're here. And the first reason we're here is because of this fire deficit and our changing fire regimes because of prolonged fire exclusion. And you can see sort of a pictorial image of what that looks like, where our forests are very dense, they're layered, and that makes high severity fire much more likely. But this graph on the bottom shows you a network of hundreds of tree ring records across the US West, and it tells you how many sites are recording fires over time since the 1600s, right? Here's where fire suppression started, and here's that moment in 1935 when the Forest Service instituted the 10 a.m. policy. So you can see we have been very successful at suppressing fire in our forests. So the second reason we're here, not only because of that fire deficit and the increasing fuels, but because of climate change. So right now, the burned area is increasing pretty dramatically year by year by year, to the tune of about 70,000 hectares every year more are burning. And the reason for this is largely due to our hot, dry atmosphere that is drying out our fuels and promoting fires once they are ignited. So there's a very tight, strong relationship between how high the vapor pressure deficit is. You can think about it as the thirst of the atmosphere, trying to pull that water out of whatever soil, vegetation, whatever it is, and then the amount of area burned. This pattern is only going to continue as we move forward in the future. Some of the impacts of those very large wildfires are, first of all, increasing carbon emissions. Here's a graph over time from various different sources of the amount of carbon that's being fluxed to the atmosphere due to wildfire. And I just want to note that the 2020 fire season caused those CO2 emissions to totally be off the charts. We had to create this graph in a different way to show you how much CO2 is being emitted into the atmosphere. And again, this pattern looks the same for pollutants. So thinking about our air quality. Wildfires are also impacting our rivers. This is a graph over time showing you the amount in kilometers of stream and river links that are impacted within burned areas. Again, it's increasing to the tune of an extra 342 kilometers per year. This bottom graph shows you what kinds of ecosystems this is happening in. The darker colors are showing you more kilometers of stream and river length impacted, and you can see the kinds of ecosystems here on the left that are experiencing this increase in impact. Another very important impact for us to consider is that vegetation type is converting into something different. So here is just one example. From across the Southwest US and California, there are 61 examples of on the ground today forest has been converted into some other vegetation type. What I want to show you with this graphic is that 80% of those examples were triggered by high severity wildfire. Here's an example of, from that paper, what the forests are transitioning into. So here we have the type of vegetation before fire, and then you can follow the lines to see what did it turn into after fire. Very few forests are left unchanged after wildfire these days. Most of them are converting to shrubland or grassland. Part of the reason for that is because of the climate change impacts that are there on the ground after the wildfire has already passed, and recovery is trying to take place. And the likelihood of regeneration of conifer tree seedlings is getting lower and lower and lower as we move through time. So I'll just explain these colors to you. The blue colors say that conifer regeneration is likely no matter the severity of fire. The yellow colors are saying, well, conifers will recruit, but only if it was a low severity fire. The red colors are saying conifers are not going to recruit. It doesn't matter what severity wildfire you had. We're looking at this from the 80s up to the current time period, and then two different scenarios in our future, just for mid-century, so it's not that far away. You can see that the map is turning redder and yellower, and especially moving up northward as we move through time. And here's just a pictorial image of that. I live in Fort Collins, Colorado, and we see this in many places, right? So in the late 1800s, you can see this sort of open forest. By the year 2000, you can see the effect of the fire deficit very clearly. In 2002, the Hayman fire came through, very large fire. It burned 60,000 acres in just a single day in a 24-hour period. 20 years later, there's not really a tree in sight. So this is a depiction of these processes playing out in front of us. And this is happening in many locations. So this is what is going on and why we're here. We have a fire deficit problem. We have a very stark and continuing climate change problem, but we also have answers. So I want to say that here in the Forest Service, we take adaptation very seriously and have processes for it. So adaptation is the adjustment of systems in preparation for or in response to climate change. And the point of these adaptation actions is that they're designed to be intentional. This word intentionality is really important to us in the adaptation field. So we want to intentionally address climate change vulnerabilities and really target those vulnerabilities with adaptation actions and still try to meet our goals and objectives. So I want to tell you a little bit about the process we use in the Forest Service called the Adaptation Workbook. Those of you in the BLM, or if we have any Park Service folks or others here, each agency has a very similar process to thinking about adaptation. The Adaptation Workbook is a participatory process. It was developed by us here in the Forest Service, as well as folks in the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, or NIACS. The goal is to really incorporate climate change into our natural resource planning. It's a very site-specific approach. It's very flexible. It's never prescriptive. It's transparent, and it's intentional. It's currently in use for all kinds of project-level NEPA situations, as well as the forest plan revision process. And I'll just walk you through these 5 steps briefly. So first, we want to show up with an understanding of our goals and objectives. And then we work to assess how is climate change making, perhaps, making our goals and objectives vulnerable to climate change. So here we really take that site-specific approach and bring in climate change vulnerability assessments and try to understand all the details for why climate change is making, whatever you want to do vulnerable to not succeeding. Then we evaluate those management objectives given our new understanding of vulnerabilities. And then step 4 is to identify adaptation approaches and tactics that can really address those specific vulnerabilities. And here we also bring in what we call menus of adaptation strategies and approaches that are just meant to help an ID team or whoever's at the table to make these decisions decide what are the best adaptation approaches and tactics we can take. It's a way to help you brainstorm. Finally, the 5th step is to monitor, like any adaptive management process, monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of your actions. So what I want to do is try and think a little bit about how we could use this very well vetted process of the adaptation workbook to think about how we could have a more climate informed minimum requirements analysis framework. So we know in the MRAF, we need to determine if administrative action may be necessary. We know we need to determine the minimum activity. And we know we want to be transparent. We want to document our thinking and we want to be intentional. So I'm thinking about some of the ways in which we might think about wilderness in particular as we're trying to be more climate informed with our decision making. So first of all, our goals and objectives would maybe be very simply to maintain wilderness character. And I'm reminding us what wilderness character is here, and Eric did as well earlier. And let me just walk through these steps. So if we show up at the table, we're trying to maintain wilderness character, we really want to assess how climate change is making wilderness character vulnerable. Why are these shifting fire regimes making wilderness character vulnerable? That allows us to really evaluate, is administrative action necessary? And at that point, we can really think to ourselves, is climate change and wildfire bringing challenges for meeting our goals for wilderness character? Is it perhaps bringing opportunities? We do these workshops all the time, and we always ask the challenges and opportunities questions because sometimes there are opportunities out there, and it's important to think about that. With the next step 4, identifying the adaptation actions and really determining the minimum activity to meet and maintain those wilderness characteristics goals. We know a lot about prescribed fire and its success and ways to reduce fuel. The fuel reduction treatment research is really strong, and it tells us that the very most effective thing you can do to reduce the severity of wildfire is to combine prescribed fire with mechanical treatments or prescribed fire with wildfire. As Eric was saying, not every wilderness is created equal. Some of these things would not be possible in wilderness. For example, prescribed fire may be higher risk when you have high density and ladder fuels. It's certainly not suitable for non-fire adaptive systems. You have to think about the smoke impact in nearby communities. And obviously mechanical treatments are an issue in wilderness. And of course, they're not even outside of wilderness, they're almost impossible to scale. And they could have negative consequences depending on how they're done. So herein comes these menus of adaptation strategies that I wanted to introduce in a fire context. So we have a menu specifically for fire adaptation. We run through about 10 different, high-level strategies for thinking about how to manage wildfire. And then we move, sort of down from there into 26 different approaches and more than 100 example tactics. So I think there's a lot of fodder here for us to think about what really could be used in wilderness. And just as an example, some of these strategies are to reduce the risk of unacceptable fire, facilitate ecosystem adaptation to expected future climate and fire regimes, or even use fire events as opportunities for ecosystem realignment. So there's a lot of rich thinking that's gone in to trying to figure out how can we effectively manage for wildfire in any setting, whether it's a designated wilderness or not. We have gone through some planning processes using the adaptation workbook with national forests that have wildfire crisis strategy landscapes. Here's an example from the Plumas National Forest in California, where we conducted a workshop with folks on the forest there to understand what the specific climate vulnerabilities are, in this case for reforestation, and then to think about, and this is individual people putting up sticky notes and brainstorming potential adaptation tactics. And then we ask folks to vote with a little circle on which tactic they might like to move forward with. So that's just an example of how we do this kind of work in thinking about adaptation. And one thing I want to get across to you today is this is an urgent problem. You are here on this graph, and this is where we're headed, right? Temperatures are only warming. Vapor pressure deficit is only getting higher. Wildfire is only going to continue to be a bigger, larger, more gnarly problem, and its impacts are only growing. At the same time, we have a closing window for our actions to be effective. Here's an example of research showing how the window is closing in terms of just the number of days where we could successfully perform prescribed fire in certain locations. So the change in days is reducing by up to a month by the year 2100. In addition, we have a closing window in terms of avoiding widespread forest conversion. The more we're moving forward in time, the less likely we are to get successful conifer regeneration in our western forests, for example. So the time is now for us to really understand our laws, our policies, our goals and our objectives, and to think about these tools like the adaptation workbook that really help us make more climate-informed decisions and could help us have a minimum requirements analysis framework that is very transparent and it intentionally considers climate change. And the way we do this, I just want to hound in here, is to really bring in these site-specific climate change vulnerability assessments, which help us target the adaptation approaches and tactics, using those menus and people's creativity to figure out what we can do to determine that minimum activity for taking action in wilderness. Okay, and now I am done. So thank you very much.
Feel free to either put a question in the chat, come on screen, ask a question. We have about 10 minutes available, so we're happy to answer anything. Almost anything, actually. You gave a very interesting facial expression when I said that, Dusty.
Yeah, speak for yourself, Eric, on what questions you're going to answer.
All right, folks, don't be shy.
So until the question comes up, I do want to say, until I jumped into starting to work on manual updates, the thing I was actually going to work on, and Shelley and I had started talking about it, is developing a kind of really doing a better linkage between the adaptation workbook process and the MRAF. If you look at what she went through, there's some real amazing similarities between the MRAF process and the adaptation workbook process and the questions that are being asked and how they line up with step 1 or step 2 of the MRAF. So that is something I'm hoping to start working on here in the near future, is really working with Shelley on developing that connection between those two processes, because they really connect very nicely. Okay, I delayed long enough to get a question.
All right, so there's 2 questions in the chat. The first one is, what is your advice for units that want a quick answer rather than stepping through a thoughtful planning process? I mean, this is such a complex, and I think Shelley, you can come to this as well. I think, especially since you were involved with the plumas, I don't think there is a fast, quick answer. Especially if you want to go through that thoughtful process. Especially if we're talking about wilderness and wild and scenic river corridors and the sideboards that we have in law to protect and enhance the river values and to preserve wilderness character. Those are some pretty high bars that require some thoughtful, a lot of thought around them, and you can't just apply something and hope it works. So I don't think there is a quick process, but I'll let you go into a little bit more detail on that, Shelley.
No, I would agree. I don't think there is a quick process, and I think it is very important to be thoughtful because of litigation, because of unintended consequences, for all kinds of reasons. But I don't know, if you wanted a quick answer and you didn't think there was going to be litigation, I guess I would say go out there and start a fire and get some prescribed fire in the landscape. But yeah, I think this really must be thoughtful. It must be intentional, and we really must show our work in terms of how we're thinking about making these decisions effectively.
Right. Thank you. Next question is, can you speak to the need to change public perspective of prescribed fire across the country and some resources to help managers work with their local communities?
Yeah, and I know there's some areas in California right now that are actually going through an RAF process to look at prescribed fire in several wilderness areas. And one of the things, from what my understanding is, there's some local wilderness advocacy groups that are actually, looking at what the goal of the project is, and then they're looking at the wilderness areas that have burned in that area the last several years, and they're realizing the reasons why they wanted these designated disappeared in 2020 and 2021 with large wildfires, and the benefit that prescribed fire itself can have, to actually preserve the reason those areas were designated. Again, we talked about philosophically, whether it be wilderness or not, prescribed fire has a negative connotation to a lot of people, no matter where it's located, and you're going to have a hard time getting anybody to agree that it is the tool for all cases. So I just think, some of what Shelley's been showing as far as the change of climate, and the windows that we have right now, and really talking the science, is really going to be our primary method that we're going to get any messages across. But again, really looking at the values and the quality of wilderness character, or the ORVs associated with rivers. What happens to those when you have a large wildfire go through? Some of those ORVs are getting lost. Some of those the qualities of wilderness character are getting lost. And what are the benefits of project work that can we keep those from getting lost? Is really our primary messaging. Shelley, any thoughts on that?
Just would agree. It's a huge need to educate the public and try and change the perspective. And one thing I think there's maybe this is a window of opportunity right now in many ways because of our awakening and our understanding of indigenous burning practices in the past that definitely happened on wilderness and cultural burning practices. And I think that might be a road into public perception of prescribed fire and its usefulness, especially in the situation we're in. So that's an area that I'm really interested in, is thinking about how looking to our indigenous partners for how they manage these landscapes, even wilderness, right? There's scientific evidence that indigenous people were burning in wilderness areas, through time in the past. And so I think we could use that as leverage to educate the public on how this is a useful tool that has been used for, since time immemorial.
Great. The next question is, are there similar projected maps for the eastern United States regarding regeneration and reduction and prescribed burning windows?
So the prescribed burning window research is global. So that is out there. In terms of regeneration probabilities, that tool, that piece of work I showed you is actually a nice Google Earth Engine tool that we can go in and work with, but it is only for the US West. So currently I'm not aware of any products that look at regeneration failure or success outside of the US West, but those may be coming online because climate change is affecting, it's not just the US West where it's affecting, but certainly where it's most stark in terms of the wildfire pieces.
Yeah, I'm kind of reading through yours, Pete, as quickly as I possibly can. So that was actually in one of my slides, and I took it out just to give Shelley some extra time here. Was related to the complexity and the perceived complexity associated with analysis for project work, and that is something we have heard several times. We heard that very early on with wildfire crisis strategy, from some line officers, and the push to get projects out fast, that they just quickly looked at, designated area, circle it, move on to the next spot, kind of a thing. So, yes, we understand. So we are, and that's why I said, this is a really challenging discussion because it
we need to talk about what law and policy really say we have to do without saying that, yes, we're promoting that you run out there immediately and start doing prescribed burn. That's not what, like I said, that's not what we're trying to focus on, but we have to help people understand law and policy are not as restrictive as they think. And we are trying to provide tools to help people understand that. We're working on a communication toolkit to, again, get that information out there. But there's a really fine balance to promoting the high bar of doing project work in wilderness areas and wild and scenic rivers, while understanding that some of this work needs to happen for the preservation of those areas at the same time. Yeah, and I see the question about RX and trammeling. So again, I did pose those questions about that ethical discussion, and I do think that kind of ties into it, and really thinking of the actions of the past that are causing the actions of present, and where does that fit in your philosophical discussion on that trammeling scale?
Yeah, and just adding to that, I mean, it would be wonderful philosophical discussion to have to ask, isn't wildfire suppression trammeling? We are preventing natural ecological processes, and it's created this fire deficit and the problem we're in. So it's really something to think about. It's not just actions, but lack of actions could be considered trammeling. Again, philosophical questions.
Yep.
Great. Thank you so much.